So let me use Jess's Photoshop file as an example, and maybe Jackie's too. So rotoscope, right? Okay, looks like this is your PSD. I'm going to copy this. To my drive. Copy, paste. And then Jackie, yours might be here possibly?
It should be.
Jackie, this one I'm assuming?
Yes.
So copy and paste. All right, thank you both in advance. Okay, so before we open After Effects, this is the folder structure that I recommend that you use. So we are going to, here's our assignment folder, for instance, After Effects demo. And then we'll make two folders. We're gonna call one Elements, and your Photoshop file will go in there. And any Photoshop files that you're gonna use from your classmates, all of that will go into Elements. If you create additional artwork for this assignment, it's gonna go into Elements. If you wanna work with sound effects, those sound files will also go into Elements. And then we'll make another folder called Projects, and this is where we're gonna save the After Effects file. So I'll keep Photoshop open for now. We're gonna open After Effects. The great thing about doing animation in a Photoshop to After Effects workflow is that because they're both Adobe, you get a lot of flexibility between the two programs. So all of your layers in Photoshop will come in exactly as layers in After Effects. So that's why it's important to be organized when you are animating in Photoshop, because that will just make your life easier in After Effects. So we'll set up a new project. Here's the project window in After Effects. This project window this is where we import everything to. You can think of this as like your project library. Down here is your render queue panel, which we'll get to. And then here is our timeline. There's nothing in it yet because we haven't made anything. And then this composition window, or comp for short, this is going to be where we're looking at what is in our scene. So we can create a new composition by clicking this button or coming down to this icon down here. And before we even start, we want to make sure we're at all of the settings we need for class. So 1920 by 1080, we're going to animate at 24 frames per second. Make sure your pixels are the square shaped. And then here, just make sure your duration is the same as your shot length. For this week's assignment, because we're doing keyframe animation, I'm going to ask that you produce 8 seconds of animation this week. It sounds like a lot, but you'll see when you animate with keyframes, there are quicker ways of doing things than doing frame by frame. So I'll show you how to convert the duration from frames into seconds.
But how did you get here? You just get there once you start?
New comp window.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to open a new comp. And then the way I want you to name your comps is always call it main, and then name it after your shot or your scene number. We're gonna start like this. So that shows up in our project window. If I double click it, it opens in our timeline, and here we have it in our comp window. Before we do anything else, I also want you to set up similar folders inside After Effects. So we'll make an Elements folder that will mimic what we have on our hard drive, and then instead of making a Projects folder, we're going to make a Comps folder. So a composition in After Effects, or a comp, is essentially a container. So we can create containers, and we're going to nest containers within each other. So sometimes you will have additional comps or compositions that you will make to make animating or grouping things easier, and then you'll just organize it into this folder here. So now we can import those PSDs from Jess and from Jackie. So I like to use shortcuts. So if I select my elements folder and then use the shortcut Control-I or Command-I on a Mac, that will open up the import window, and we will just navigate to our project folder and organize in our elements. We're going to import this one file at a time. Now, your import settings are going to be highly important. Look for this menu option. You want to import it as a composition. So there's several options for you to import things into After Effects, but if you're working with a Photoshop file, you need to import that as a composition so that you have access to all of your separate layers. Otherwise, everything's going to be merged together into one layer and you don't get to manipulate them separately. So you must import as a composition, and then we will bring that in. And then you'll have additional options here. For now, we can just merge everything into the layer. This would allow you to, if you put effects or filters in Photoshop, this option, keeping this option editable, would allow you to further make adjustments in After Effects. So there's a really nice kind of fluid relationship between Photoshop and After Effects. But in general, whatever you do in Photoshop, you want that to be done before you come into After Effects. So we're going to merge it. And then you'll see it brought it in as 2 items. So here is a folder with all of Jackie's layers. Was this Jackie's? No, this is Jess's. And then we have the comp itself. So let's double click this. And this is going to mimic and represent the way Jess had set up his Photoshop file. So let's use this circle icon here. That's the solo group. And if you solo it, it lets you see all of the elements in it. So here is, let's see, turn on transparency. So Jess, of course, I'm putting you on the spot, but you did a great job of organizing your layers and naming everything. So I know exactly what I'm looking at here. So this is why it is important to be organized in Photoshop so that you can open it in After Effects and know exactly what everything is. So here's Floating Man, and here is the face. Yeah, so really nicely organized. So what we can do now is to take layers from Jess's project and we can combine them with layers from Jackie's project. So let's import Jackie's PSD. So I'll do the same thing. Select your elements folder first, and then I'll show you the menu, file, import, file, and then this one's Jackie's. Make sure you import as composition. Don't import as footage. Composition will allow you to keep all of those layers separate. So we'll import that as composition. And then we'll merge any kind of style. Okay, so you might get this error if the video file is still in your Photoshop document. So there could be a chance. So let's just see what's happening. We're just going to open this in Photoshop.
Yeah, I was like getting in a rush this past week.
That's okay. Yeah.
I like started out organized, and then it just got really messy, and I don't know what's happening.
Yeah, no. Thank you for being willing to be put on the spot. So let's see. Yeah. So it looks like this was your original source footage.
Yeah.
So we're going to delete it out of your Photoshop file so that we don't have an issue bringing it into After Effects. This is just sort of a buggy thing. So for each of you, I would recommend just deleting your video file. When you're done deleting that, we're going to save it again and then come back to After Effects, re-import it, and let's see if it is happier. So elements, file, import, file. Import as composition, import. Okay, so see, that works. So that's just a bug between Photoshop and After Effects. If that happens to you, just delete your actual video footage, and then that should work. So let's click on this comp of the waltz. Double click, it will open in its own composition window, and then here we can see all of the different files. Now, right now, Jess's scene is separate from Jackie's, right? We can also open each individual layer here. Here's the scarf, so you see that. I can turn off the transparency with this button, and now we have just the scarf animation on this layer here. So you can double click on a layer and it shows up in its own footage window. But if you want to see the whole Photoshop document, make sure you're double clicking on this icon. Now what we want to do though is to kind of start mixing and matching, right? We're going to create a new scene out of elements from other people's scenes. So what we can do, we've got our main composition here. Why don't we take this face animation? Yep. So I'm just going to copy and paste this, Control C on Windows, and then in here I'm going to paste it, Control V. And now we can't see anything because there is no color there. So we can easily add color.
Where did you copy and paste it on?
I just copy and paste it here. I just click in this blank area.
Where did you like? Because it was.
I grabbed it from this comp, from the Floating City comp.
And then, how did it become blank?
Oh, it's not blank. It's just not visible yet because there's no color. So let's add just like give our background a color. So we can come up to Composition Settings or Control K, and then we can just quickly adjust the color here. And now we can see it. So it was there, it just wasn't visible. So now we have the animation that is, we can't change it because it was already drawn, it came in from Photoshop, but all the timing, all of that is here. And now the power of After Effects allows you to add keyframe animation on top of any other kind of footage or hand-drawn frame-by-frame animation. So if you scroll down or twirl down this little caret sign, it will show you what are the properties available for you to animate. This is going to be similar to the Photoshop timeline if some of you tried that this week. So anywhere you see a stopwatch, that means you can animate that property. So let's turn on the position stopwatch, and here we've got our arrow tool selected. So I can reposition this head, and it made a diamond shape. That means there's a keyframe there. And I can go to the end of this animated clip, and if I reposition it, now I have added animation on top of the drawn animation. Right now, the keyframe is called linear, which is represented by a diamond shape. There's different kinds of keyframes in After Effects. If I move this closer, then obviously the timing's going to be faster, right? But there's different kinds of keyframes. Let me zoom in. I'm pressing plus and minus on the top of the keyboard to zoom in and zoom out. So if we right-click on this keyframe, and we can go to toggle hold keyframe, that changes its shape. It turns into a box. So what that means is if I add another keyframe, it's not going to in between those positions. It's going to pop from position to position. So here's the linear keyframe, and then it popped. Let me spread these out so you can see it better. So here it's on linear, and then so do you see how it jumps to different positions? So that's what a hold keyframe does. If you were interested in kind of a animating a cutout style of like stop motion, but using the digital tools to mimic that because it's a little bit faster, then you could animate on hold keyframes to mimic that sort of like handmade feeling. So for instance, I could animate every 2 frames. I'm pressing page up and page down, and I can just position this by hand, and I get more of a traditional frame-by-frame animation feeling rather than something that's so linear and smooth and maybe computery.
How are you placing the frames?
In the timeline,
Yeah.
I'm using page up and page down to go
it's placing
frame by frame.
moving?
Yep, page up and page down.
So now how are you moving between them?
How am I moving between the keyframes? I'm using J and K on the keyboard to go frame by frame. So J and K, oops, sorry. I'm gonna press U also and press home to bring me back home. So if I play this, can you see how that has a different quality of motion than something that's very linear? So that's how you can achieve something that feels a little bit more traditional using keyframe animation. Essentially, you're keyframing on 2s. Now, the nice thing about keyframe animation, though, is that we don't have to do all those in-between frames. But we still want to control the quality of movement, right? We're animators, we're studying the principles of animation and physics. So, by the way, if you double click on something, it might open in its own window. So just make sure you always know what you're looking at. We want to come back to our comp window. So another kind of keyframe that's very helpful is called the ease. So right click here, we're going to go to keyframe assistant. And then here is where we get the easing in and easing out that we talked about with the acceleration and deceleration. So After Effects calls it easy ease, and we can either do easy ease or we can pick one specifically. So we could just do easy ease for now, and you're going to see it's going to slowly accelerate out of this position. So did you notice that? Here, I'm going to undo it. Here it is, just linear keyframes. It has a very constant velocity, right? But with the ease on it, right click, keyframe assistant, easy ease. When I play it, now there's a slow acceleration. Now, when you do keyframe animation, especially in After Effects, Toon Boom Harmony will have a similar idea. And then when you get into CG animation too, a lot of CG animation really is animating in keyframes. You will have some version of this graph editor. So in After Effects, it's called the graph editor, and it's this button here. And it's going to give us a different view of that timeline. So this is more mathematical now, and it will help us adjust the curves. So it's interpreting the movements as curves, and this is where we can really control how much easing in and easing out that we want. The thing to note is that there's 2 views in the graph editor. So right click, and we have the value graph or the speed graph. To control the easing in and easing out, we do want the speed graph here. So if you click on one of these, especially if it has an ease on it, it's going to give you these handles. And I'm pulling on the handle, just clicking and dragging, and you see how it's affecting the shape of that curve. So this means it's going to affect the quality of the movement, specifically the velocity. So if we play it again, did you notice how that easing out is really expanded now because I've changed the shape of the curve? So I can adjust my spacing, right? The timing is the same because it's where the keyframes are, but the spacing of how that acceleration is happening, I'm doing that purely by manipulating these handles rather than trying to kind of calculate it frame by frame. So this is where the power and also the efficiency of working in After Effects comes from. So play with some layers Here's the position keyframe, here's the scale, you've got rotation and opacity, which is the transparency on a layer. The fun part is really going to be combining aspects from different scenes and creating a new scene out of it. So let's see what kind of background elements we can borrow from Jackie's scene. I'm going to solo the layer as a nice way of finding out what's there. So this one could be a nice one to use. I'm going to rename it by hitting Enter on the keyboard. And this is our background blurred. And then what else do we have? Oh yeah, that's a nice element too. Maybe we have some foreground elements. Let's see. Okay, we've got some rocks in the foreground, trees. Okay, why don't we try these trees? So I'm just going to Control C to copy it, come back to my main comp, click in here, and then Control V. And now I've brought it in. It covered up the head animation because I still had the solo button turned on. So just turn it off, everything else appears. So now we've got different elements that we can put in our scene. Here is that foreground grass layer or bush layer. I'm going to rename it so that we can keep things straight. So foreground, it's like a shrub. And then I can duplicate this, so Control D, and then if I reverse the scale of it, I can actually flip it and then put it on the other side of my screen. So that would be a scale attribute. I'm going to unlink these two coordinates here, and then just type in -100. And now you see how I flipped it? So I can easily just duplicate that shrub, and now I've got one for either side of my frame. And then I'll link this back again. You'll notice all of these coordinates that are attached to your animation properties. There's two coordinates, so think of it as X and Y, because the, After Effects is a 2D program. So if you remember from math class, you've got on a graph, you've got your X coordinate and your Y coordinate. So this is the scale on the X axis. I can click and drag, and you'll see there's my horizontal axis. So I'm scaling it on that axis versus scaling it on the Y axis. So that's what those two coordinates mean. And obviously, if you link them together, then they're going to be scaled in proportion to each other. So I want you to play around with creating a new scene out of existing elements, either from your own Photoshop file or from someone else's. And then I want you to play with animating what's in that scene. In addition to working with elements that have been created in Photoshop, you can also import footage. And you can also create elements of your own natively within After Effects. So one thing that you might want to play with is the Shape tool. So come up here to where it says rectangle. If you click and hold, you'll see different shapes available to you. Why don't we start with we'll make a sun for our scene. So we'll start with the ellipse tool. And notice up here at the top, it's similar to Photoshop. Any tool that you click on will have its own set of properties up here at the top that you can further adjust. So for our ellipse tool, we've got some properties here. So let's say we are making a sun in the sky. So we can choose the fill color. We can even give that sun an outline by putting a stroke around it. So right now there's no stroke because there's a line through it, but you can always click on the word. Anything that's a blue highlight is actually a link, and you can open that up for further adjustments. So we can just set it to normal. And now we've got we're gonna have a white border that's 2 pixels wide around that sun. So you can adjust this too. So we've got our ellipse, and okay. let's just see what happens. So I'm going to hold down Shift and click, and this will allow me to make a perfect circle. Otherwise, I get more of an oval like this. So I'm just going to undo that, Control Z.
Does it automatically make a new layer?
It does when you use this tool.
Okay.
It's called a shape layer. And so here we've got a circle. We can make a few adjustments, but you can see this kind of layer has certain properties to it. It has your regular transform properties, but it also has additional ones called content ellipse. And if you go inside, you get some additional things to play with. So anywhere you see a stopwatch means that you can animate that property. Also, I want to point out the pan behind tool. So this allows you to move the anchor point on any layer. So you'll notice by default the anchor point is this, and it's always going to be just right in the middle of your layer. But I made this sun, right? And if I rotate it, it's rotating from this edge. So depending on what I have in mind, I may not want that anchor point to be right there on the edge. So how do you move the anchor point? So you're going to use this tool, the pan behind tool, which is Y on your keyboard. And then using that tool, you can now click and drag, and you can move this anchor point. So let's say I actually want to animate this sun kind of like rising above and below the horizon. So if I move the anchor point all the way down here, and then I set a rotation on my sun layer, let me just rename that as sun. So I'm going to set a keyframe first and rotate it all the way down here. And then I'll go to the end of my scene and then rotate it the other way. Now I have this nice animation just by animating the rotation, but it's because I moved that anchor point. So let's put the sun behind our scene, and now we have some, basic things starting to happen. Okay, so that's a shape layer. Let me show you how you can mask certain layers or footage. So masking means that you're hiding something, right? So let's take the background from Jackie's. Let's take this whole background, right? So there's no animation on it, which is fine. We're going to use it as more of a texture. So I'm going to Control-C, copy that into my main comp, Control-V. And then now we can use the same shape this. We can use that same shape tool, but now we can draw a shape on the background layer, and we've got what's called a mask. So you'll see that if you click on it, you get to edit the points on this mask. Give me 1 second. Here's mask. So we'll use the pen tool here to be able to select one of these points, or we could draw our own. I'm holding down Command or Alt, and I can change the curves. And if I'm still holding down Alt, but if I click and drag, then I get more control on the curves here. So I'm basically cutting a shape out of that whole layer, and I can either animate this as its own sort of textured ball, or we can use it to cut out a window. So if you hit M on a layer, it will reveal or hide any masks that you have on that layer. And you can keyframe. The mask has its own set of properties. We can even put a feather edge on that mask here, like this. But look at this menu here. We've got add or subtract. So let's try subtract. And now all of a sudden, we have more like a window cut out of this layer. So this reminds me of Jose's project where he had an actual window in the background, right? And then you had other things behind it. You could easily do that here in After Effects by using a shape to cut a hole out. So now we're almost creating a vignette or a window through which we're seeing other things happen in the background. And if you switch it back to add, then that will change it. You can also try inverting the mask, and that does the same thing as subtract. So use the pen tool in here. You've got different options, but this is how you can create your own custom shapes, and also it's a nice way to isolate just a section of an image. Links, when you were cutting out the headphones, right, in your project. So if you use the pen tool, it gives you really good control. You do have to manually cut it out, and there's some ways where AI automates it, but let me show you an example of that. Let me delete this mask. And so with the pen tool,
How did you add the mask?
yes, so there's two ways to add the mask. The first way I showed you was just using this tool, and with my layer selected, I drew the shape,
Isn't it the
and there's
shape
the
tool?
mask. It's the same, yes. So the same tool can do two different things. If I have a layer selected and I'm using the shape tool, it's going to create a mask. But if I have nothing selected, like I click out here, and I use the same tool, it's going to automatically make a shape. So yeah, that's a good distinction to understand. But let's say we want to cut a shape, a specific shape out of a photo, right? If you can learn the pen tool, it's going to be really handy. So I've got the pen tool selected. I'm going to cut a shape out of this blurred layer. So click and drag gives you a point with handles. So imagine you're tracing the edge of an object with this curved line. This is a very rough shape of some headphones, by the way. And then just make sure you close that. This is called a path. So just make sure you close it when you see that little circle icon there. So now it's closed. But now I've basically cut out the shape without destroying the layer. Because as soon as I click and move these points, right, that texture is still underneath. So you can create specific shapes, and then you can edit the curved path by pressing Command. It lets you control each handle on its own. Or you can click in the center and get rid of the handles, or click, drag again and get both your handles back. So now we have, all of a sudden, let's switch back to this arrow, right? We've created our own shape out of a layer, or we could even do this on a regular solid layer. So this looks more like arches now in the back. So there's a mask. Let's see, we can even put this in front of the face. And then just like in Photoshop, you can change the blend mode of layers in After Effects too. So let's try this. I'm gonna hit S for scale, just move my arches a little bit bigger. And then so here's all these switches and these different icons. Come down to the bottom where it says toggle, and then we'll press that button, and now we have some more options here. This is where our blending modes are. So this will be similar to After Effects. So we could take this blurred archway, change the blending mode, change it to multiply, and now we see the head behind it. We can change it to color burn. That doesn't affect too much. Let's try screen. Let's try linear dodge. Right, so you see how the sun is actually behind it, but because we have a blending mode on this layer, it's affecting the appearance of the layers underneath. So you can get some nice effects, different color changes, color palettes going on like this. So that's something to play with. Now let's briefly talk about camera moves, right? So one of the limitations that you need to be aware of is that you can only zoom in as far as your image quality, right? So here I'm zoomed in to 400%, but we're starting to lose the quality on the leaves that Jackie painted, right? So if we wanted to zoom everything in closer, we're going to lose quality. So that just means that in Photoshop, you're going to actually have to start at a bigger sized canvas to accommodate any kind of camera moves. So I think the best way for me to explain this is to just draw it here quickly. So let's say you want to animate a pan, right? So that means your Photoshop file is going to have to actually be much longer than 1920 by 1080. Okay. So remember the field guide that you used for your flipbooks, right? That plastic sheet, we traced a 7 field. So a field is essentially what your camera is framing. So a pan means that it's several fields long, right? So you can have a very short pan, just 2 fields wide, but this will dictate what your Photoshop canvas needs to be as big as this, so you have enough room to pan it around. If you wanted to do a zoom in or zoom out, right? Remember we drew at a 7 field for the flipbooks, but it could go up to 12 field or even more, 14 field, right? So it's that same idea. So in Photoshop, I mean, you could do the math.
38, 40.
30.
That would be like twice as long, but the same height.
Okay, so that would be like this, right? 38, 40 by 1080. But if you wanted it to zoom in from out here to something closer, something like this, right? Then both dimensions of your Photoshop file would have to be big enough to accommodate that camera move. So in Photoshop, that's very easy to do. Here. So we'll make a new document. And then last week, I just had you use a template, right? Film and video template. But we want actually to be bigger so that we can accommodate a camera move. So let's do the 2 field pan first. So let's try 380 by 40. 380 by 40. And we'll call this our background pan. Create that. It's going to be long, obviously. But we can add our layers here. So someone had clouds animating. I think Faith, your project had the clouds going by. So imagine just doing your clouds. Brush, B for brush. Here's my clouds, because I'm drawing with a mouse. But imagine just laying them all out here. Clouds. And then say we have a ground layer. Put that underneath. Here is my ground or my horizon line, like that. And then I would further suggest giving yourself some margins too. So let's go to image size. Because this is exactly like 2 fields, but we want to give ourselves maybe a 10% margin so that in After Effects you have a little bit of room if things don't line up exactly. So the way to add 10% to any canvas size is to go up to the image menu, image size, and then here just change this to percentage. And so let's increase that to 110%. 110%. Click OK. And then now if we go back to image size, change it to pixels, right? It's bigger than what we typed in, but this will give you the margin to work with in After Effects. So I'll save this quickly, bring it into After Effects to show you. So I'll save it into my Elements folder. Here's my background pan. And then I'll import it into After Effects. So select Elements folder, Control-I to import, select my background pan, and make sure you import as a composition. And then import that in. And then if I zoom out, right, here's the whole canvas. But if we bring this into our main comp, let me change this back to normal. And then in my background pan, I'm going to double click that. I'm going to turn off this white background because I don't need it. It's actually transparent. This little flowchart is a helpful way to navigate between your different comps in After Effects. So come back to the main comp. And then now here is my background pan. And you can very easily just keyframe the position on that. So we'll turn on the position keyframe. And I'm just dragging this over. I'm holding down Shift so that it drags over in a straight line. But do you see how the edge of my comp is actually smaller than the edge of my layer, right? So giving yourself that margin is important because it gives you just a little bit of room to reposition. So here's my first keyframe, and then here is my end keyframe. I could even move that further in the scene. So now all of a sudden, I've got a panning background, or I have the illusion of clouds moving. Or you can imagine you have a shot that's staged inside a car, and then you've got the background panning out the window while the things in the foreground kind of remain stationary. So that's one way to do a camera move. And then the final thing I'll show you is how to do a full zoom in. So before we get to 3D layers and cameras and After Effects, I'm going to show you this easy way. We're going to attach all of these layers to an invisible object to mimic a camera move. So a panning is easy, I just showed you. But if you want to do a zoom in, I would recommend you doing this. So we can go up to Layer, New, Null Object. And it's null because it's nothing. But you can attach properties to it and you can still keyframe it. It's just invisible. So we've got all the same keyframeable options. So let's attach all of our layers to it. So I'm going to select and drag all the layers in my scene. And see this spiral here. There's a parent and link column. There's a spiral there. Make sure you don't grab the wrong spiral, not this one from the track mat. Let me switch it back. You want this one under parent and link. So select all your layers, grab the spiral, and then attach it to the null. And then let's just rename the null as camera. We're pretending this is our camera. And now if I move that null, everything is going to follow it. So I can move it off center, and whatever animation, like the sun animation, that's still happening. It just all got shifted over. So we can use that same idea and animate the scale on the null to then animate either zooming in or zooming out. So here's the scale, all the layers are attached to it. And then if we do a zoom out, we'll just scale it down like this. And then now we have this, illusion of tracking out of a scene. So obviously you can scale in, more than 100%, but this is where you're going to lose resolution quality unless your Photoshop layer was big enough to begin with. Is that one way to hide the fact that you are losing resolution is to add a blur on it.
I see.
So yeah, so here's the face, and then go to Layer, Blur, and then Gaussian Blur, And then here in the effect controls, you can actually change the blurriness, and you could hide a little bit any loss in resolution.
Nice.
So I recorded this part, I'll also post
Okay.
this, but you can always put a blur just to hide it.
Sure. Got it.
Does it act like a composition?
Does what acts like a composition?
The null.
The null acts like an object, but it's invisible.
So it carries everything, like all the layers, right?
That's because I parented it. So I attached it to the null. I did this. Yep. Yep. That's why everything is moving with it. Yeah. Okay. So I am going to post this tutorial, and then I'm also going to repost the one from last semester, which was attached to the rotoscope assignment. So I recommend that you watch both to get more of a sense of how to use After Effects. But I will specify the minimum requirements on Google Classroom. Essentially, I'm looking for keyframe animation, and I'm looking for either a panning camera move or a zooming in, zooming out camera move. And I'm looking for you to use someone else's Photoshop assets in addition to anything else you'd like to do. So it's purely After Effects work this week. It's purely keyframe animation this week, no drawing. And then see what you can do, see what you can create with it. Okay, I'm going to dismiss everyone, and then I know you've got a question. So. Yeah.